Welcome, Bruins, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar, Studying Climates and Carnivores, Past and Present, to Better Understand the Future. My name is Lauren Bavena, and I serve as Director of Regional Engagement at the UCLA Alumni Association. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our Alumni Association sustaining donors. It is with your help that we are able to strengthen the Bruin community with programs like this. So for just some general webinar housekeeping, we will have an hour for today's webinar, and we'll leave time at the end for your questions. So feel free to use the Q&A feature below to submit your questions at any time during the program. We will be recording the event today, and we will be sharing that out with everybody. I would now like to introduce our faculty speaker, Dr. Anthony Friscia. He is the director of the UCLA Cluster Program and an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology. He is a mammalian paleontologist and functional morphologist who studies how the shape of organisms, both living and extinct, relates to their ecologies. He teaches courses on biological evolution and human anatomy and has won a number of teaching awards for his efforts. He has been doing field work in Kenya since 2009 and has traveled extensively throughout Africa. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks for inviting me to do this. Lauren and I have gotten to know each other a bit through Bruin Bounds, and we've traveled a bit around the country to draw in new Bruins. So it was nice to be able to do this for her. So I'm going to talk today about some of my research that I've done. And so I'm going to share a screen here and show some slides while I do this. So let me do that there we go. Hopefully people can see that. So I am a faculty member here in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology. I'm also the director of our Cluster Program, which is a freshman freshman general education program that's kind of unique. And if you don't know about that, I'd be happy to answer questions about that as well. But in terms of my research, which is what I'm here to talk about today, I like to ask particular types of questions about the past. So I consider myself a paleontologist, and I ask questions about how communities of organisms, so I like to study how organisms kind of work together in communities and how they respond to climate change and how their interactions between members are going to change across geologic time. I also study how the morphology of organisms, that is their shape, how that relates to their ecology, that is what they do. And I also study kind of how evolution works, right? How we can model evolution and things along those lines. And the tool that I often use to do this is looking at carnivorous mammals. So ancestors of lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and that's what I use often as my model. And they're often a good model for doing that. You'll hopefully see why that is. So I've kind of divided my talk up into two parts. We'll see if I can get to both parts. I tend to over prepare for these sorts of things. But the first project I'm going to talk about is studying climates in the Middle Eocene. I'll talk about what that timeline is. And this is actually part of an NSF funded project that I do in Northeast Utah. I'll talk about kind of where we work in just a bit here. And I do this with some colleagues at other universities. You can see that on the slide here. And so I'm going to talk about this work we've been doing in Utah for a number of years now, actually. So to give you some kind of context here, so this is the time scale for the Cenozoic, which is the time period that we're in now. Back here, 66, 65 million years ago, that's when the dinosaurs die out, okay? And humans come around about, it depends on how you define humans, but around 300,000 years ago. So we're talking at a huge time scale, and the time period I'm interested in mostly, that my research is in the Paleogene, from about 66 to about 23 million years ago. So long before anything that looked like humans were around. And specifically for this part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about this little time period here in the middle of the Eocene, from about 34 to 56 million years ago. And this is part of what's called the Uinta and Duchenian land mammal ages. And those names aren't particularly important. They're just a way that we divide up this time period. And like I said, I do this work in Utah. So just to show you a little bit about where I work. So here's a kind of satellite view. So this is Utah here. This would be Wyoming, Colorado, This is Idaho up here. Here's Salt Lake City and the Great Salt Lake. And the area where we work is this basin here. It's called the Uinta Basin. It's surrounded by the Uinta Mountains to the north and the Book and the Roan Cliffs to the south here. If you've ever traveled in Utah and gone to like the amazing national parks in Utah and stuff like that, most of those are to the south here. Like, so Canyonlands and Arches National Park are down here, and Zion would be down this way here. So it's up in the north. Actually, the closest national park or national monument is Dinosaur National Monument, which is right here. It actually straddles the Utah-Colorado state line. And what it looks like there is ooey gooey badlands that there's fossils coming out of them. So these are kind of what it looks like. And we spend a lot of time crawling on the ground looking for fossils. Contrary to popular belief, I don't actually do a lot of digging. We do some digging, mostly because the fossils that I'm looking for are relatively small, so we can pick them up and put them in our pockets. Every once in a while we find bigger things. You know, this is the nice part about working on mammals from this time period. Things are relatively small and you don't have to, you know, do big jackets and digging and things along those sorts of lines. And just to show you some other pictures of the field there. So this is what it looks like. So these are mudstones and siltstones that were deposited mostly in what are called overbank deposits. So you can imagine that although this area now is very dry, you know, it's high desert. At the time period we were looking at, it was much wetter. There was braided streams, and every once in a while those braided streams would overflow their banks and they would deposit muds and silts, and that's what the fossils were deposited in. And so again, you can see the mudstones and sandstones. There's some big chunky sandstones here. Here's a pretty view of one of the nice canyons. You get lots of colors here. So everything from grays and greens up into reds and oranges and browns and things like that. The area is known also for having a lot of oil development. So there's the rocks below the area, the rocks that we care about, you know, much deeper rocks are reservoirs for oil. And this is an area where there's a lot of oil development. There was actually an article just recently, just last month in Mother Jones, calling the basin Mordor because it's got all kinds of air quality issues because of the oil development there and things like that. I don't think it's quite as bad as Mordor. It's actually, I find it quite pretty, although it is marred by these oil developments. And actually there's been a lot more oil and gas development recently. And then this just shows some pictures of what collection is like there. You know, again, wandering around, mostly picking stuff up on the surface. If we find stuff, we'll maybe dig into the sediment a bit more to find stuff. But you can see here, it's mostly surface collecting. Every once in a while, we do get a chance to dig, and we'll collect sediment mostly for screen washing purposes, where we'll put it in screens and put it in water, which dissolves away the mud and then hopefully leaves behind fossils. So every once in a while, we do collect sediments for that. And then just to show you some examples of what the fossils look like from there. So these are some vertebrae on my hand here. Here are some teeth of a couple different organisms, mostly rodents, it looks like. This is a bigger organism. So this is the skull of a big cow-sized sort of thing, and something that's bigger like that, when we find it on the surface, if we think there's more of it going into the hill, we will do like plaster jackets and stuff like that to bring stuff out of there. And then here's some more fossils just to show you kind of range of scale. So here's a jaw still in the ground with some teeth, again, from something kind of cow-sized. And then here are jaws. So these are teeth and jaws of some carnivorous animals, these things here. And then here's a tiny little jaw or jaw fragment with a couple teeth in it on my fingertip there. Just showing you the range of sizes of things here. This little jaw here is actually from a primate. So like I said, it's a much wetter time at that time period. It's actually much warmer. It's tropical. It's actually subtropical environments all the way up into Canada at this period of time. And there were primate relatives, monkey relatives running around at that time as well. I also like to show these pictures just to show how fragmentary things are. You know, we've all seen the scene in Jurassic Park where they, dust off and they just find the entire, fossil skeleton, and that basically just never happens. The sort of stuff we find is very fragmentary, and often what we're finding are teeth. Teeth are really exciting for us because teeth allow us to determine things not only about diet, but also taxonomy and stuff like that. Cool. And so I've been working in there since the early 90s. This work was started by Tab Rasmussen at Washington University in St. Louis, where I did my undergraduate work. And fossils had been known from this area since the early part of the last century, so the early part of the 1900s. But most of the fossil collection that was done then were for big things that would be, put up in museums, right? Like that, as museum displays and things like that. So, the Carnegie Museum, the Yale Peabody Museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, they had all sent out people to do work out in the basin back in the early 1900s. But again, they focused on big specimens that they could put on display. But there had been little animals had been found. And so when Tab started working there in the early 90s, the focus was to look for small and medium things to basically build a better picture of the entire ecosystem and not just the bigger sort of animal. And so the recent project has been going on since the 2000s. This is where we started to get money into the NSF work for it and things like that. And it's expeditions from not only UCLA, Midwestern University, College of Charleston, Lamar University in Texas, San Diego Museum of Natural History. I've been working with colleagues from all these places, and we've been collecting there since the early 2000s. And these are just some crew pics from the past few years. I always like to show this picture. This is from Google Earth, and it's actually a picture showing our campsite there. You can actually see, our cook tent, and you can see my tent and my the woman who runs the camp, Beth Townsend. You can see her tent actually on Google Earth. So this is, science you can see from space, way better than kind of sitting around looking at, Petri dishes in a lab or anything like that. One thing we've been doing recently is we've been trying to incorporate more undergraduate work. And actually this past summer, as part of the grant, I actually offered a field class where I brought students out to the field to collect fossils. There was a classroom part of the class, and then there was a field part, and they actually came out to the field. They collected fossils. They learned how, we can use those fossils to find out about things in the climates and animals in the past and apply that to today. So we actually have been bringing students out there and giving students credit for coming out there. So we did that for in a formal way this summer, offering the class through UCLA. Hopefully we're going to do that again next summer. And just to give you an idea of the sort of fossils that we've found, and so as part of the more recent work since the early 2000s, we found about over 4,000 specimens of vertebrate animals. And you can see here, and most of these are relatively small things. And you can see here, this is a breakdown kind of the different sorts of animals we find. So lots of rodents, some primates, artiodactyls and parasitactyls are hoofed animals. You can see carnivorans in here and a couple other different groups here. The thing that we mostly find out there are turtles. It's like this area is actually known for fossil turtles. You find tons and tons of them, so much that they're kind of the junk fossils and we almost ignore them now. And we just find them because, their shells are really hard, and so they preserve very well. And again, it was a much wetter time period, so there were lots of turtles running around and things at that time, but we don't include them in these graphs. And since we've been collecting there, we have found some new species that we've named, various sorts of things. So these are various insectivorous animals. We found a new primate species, some new rodents, a new carnivoran, even a new bird species. I actually have some pictures here. So these are the teeth of the new primate. This is one of the insectivorous. This is the new carnivorous animal, and this is the bone of one of the new bird species that we have. Now, it's cool to just go find fossils and name new species, and that's part of kind of the initial part of any fossil expedition. But really, we want to use these to answer bigger sorts of questions. And so the kind of questions we're trying to answer with this particular project is we want to think about climate change. And so this here shows a graph of temperature over time. And so past is here. So here's the beginning of the Cenozoic at 65 million years ago or so. Here's the present. And then this is temperature here, higher temperatures this way, lower temperatures this way, right? And you could see here, in the time period that we're interested in, it was a much warmer time. It's actually the warmest time since the dinosaurs died off 65 million years ago is within this time period. So it was a much warmer time. That usually means it was wetter. It means that sea levels were much higher and things along those sorts of lines. So this is the time period that we're interested in. And one thing you can see on this graph is that, it's not a smooth curve. There's big spikes in temperature, there's dips. You can also see there's a pretty big dip that happens kind of at the end of the Eocene here, at the end of this time period that I'm interested in. And that has to do with some things like happening with glaciers forming in the Antarctic and things along those sorts of lines. And actually the time period we live in right now tends to be a much cooler sort of time period in general, excepting kind of very recent past, which I'll talk about in a bit here. And so, there's this big change that happens here where the world got cooler, drier, grasslands spread. You got rid of kind of the tropics, subtropic sort of environments kind of retreated towards where they are now. So, the time period we're living in now is much different than the earlier time period of the Cenozoic here. Now, one thing, like I said, is there's these little peaks you can see on that graph, and we call these hypothermals or hyperthermals. And that just means they're these big peaks in temperature that we see. And there's a couple really well-known ones. There's one right at the beginning of the Eocene at the Paleocene-Eocene boundary at about 56 million years ago. It was a period of about 10,000 years of extreme global warming. The world had this big jump in 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. There's another one about 5 million years after that happens, or 4 to 5 million years after that happens, called the early Eocene climatic optimum. And these are well documented. Both of these are well documented in other places in North America in the fossil record. But there's another one called the Middle Eocene climatic optimum, and it's relatively unknown in North America. You can actually see it on this graph here. It's this little peak here. Okay, and so this peak here has not really been studied. And so we consider this the last hypothermal event of the Eocene. It was first identified in ocean sediments in the Southern Ocean. And it's about a 4 degrees rise in temperature over a pretty long time period, over hundreds of thousands of years. It was identified first in the Northern Hemisphere in some localities in Italy. It was identified in terrestrial sediments here in Montana first, but we knew the sediments that we had in Utah kind of span this time period. So part of the goal of this recent project was to document that change, see if we could see that change, and then also document what happens to the mammals at that time. And so that's what we've been working on. I've got some graphs here. The numbers and things aren't particularly important. But one thing that's interesting, so this graph, it's a little odd because it's flipped. So older is this way, younger is this way. And here we're showing those hyperthermal events. This is the PETM, the Paleocene Eocene. Here's that early Eocene one, and here's the Middle Eocene one. And this blue line here shows basically mammalian diversity, basically the number of genera of mammals, right? How many different mammals there were around. And one thing that you can see is that in these earlier hyperthermal events, you see this big increase in mammalian diversity that's associated with that. You don't really see that, or you don't really see that with the time period we're looking at here. You see a big drop off, and there may be an increase after that. So that's one thing that we want to kind of document and get a better sort of view on. And another thing that we're doing is actually collecting data on the temperature then. And again, the numbers here aren't important, but basically we can look at isotopes of various elements in the rocks to look at temperatures. And so we can actually document the temperature change. But like I said, one thing that we're really interested in is what happens to the mammals. So we know that they become more diverse, but we also see other sorts of changes. A lot of animals during warm periods will get smaller in size. This is especially true of hoofed animals. So artiodactyls and parasadactyls are various hoofed animals. Most primates kind of get smaller at that time. There's also other animals increase in size at that time. So carnivores and rodents tend to increase when you see increases in temperature. And the ecological reasons for these changes are interesting and complex. And I'm not going to get into it. There's some physiological reasons why that happens, as well as ecological reasons why that happens. But one thing we're trying to document with our work here is to actually see if this is the case, right? If we can see these changes along with those sorts of changes in diversity. And then the next question is, well, why do we care? Well, the reason why is we're going through a warming event now, a warming event that, suggests that we could see an increase of about the same magnitude of about 4, or so degrees Celsius by, 2100. So in about, the next 70 to 80 years, especially if we don't do anything to try and change that. And this is very similar to this increase we see at the time, back in the past. And so what we're trying to, what we hope to be able to do is look at the sort of changes you see in fossil animals and then see if we can predict what might happen to animals now. How are these temperature changes and this global warming that's happening now, how is that going to affect, modern animals, right? How is it going to affect biodiversity and things like that today? And so those are the sorts of questions that we want to ask. And we're just starting to get some data on some of this sort of things. And so, and we're working on publishing some of this sort of work right now. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're doing in Utah and why we think this sort of work is important and how it can be applied to sort of things today. These are the sorts of, things that we outline when we, apply for grant money to get them to do this sort of work and stuff like that. Now, like I said, one thing that I'm particularly interested in is, let me move this over to the side. One thing that I'm particularly interested in is the carnivores, because I think that they're a nice model to look at these sorts of things. And so if you go back to the slide I've highlighted here, one thing that we should see is an increase in size in the carnivores. And it turns out that we are actually starting to get some data that sees this. And this actually comes out of some work that's being done in the lab of my PhD advisor. I got my PhD here at UCLA under Dr. Blair Van Valkenburg in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And she has a grad student right now who's working on kind of broad trends in carnivores across this whole period of time. And one thing that we see is actually we do see an increase in size in carnivores that's associated with this event. So this is the event here, and this is body mass here is this line here. And so we do actually see an increase in body size at this time. And so this is some preliminary work, and it's some work that's going to be coming out relatively soon, led by one of Dr. Van Valkenburg's grad students, Mark June. The other thing I'm interested in is just kind of like figuring out what carnivores were there, right? And so we named a new species, this thing here called Miocyon vallis rubrae, which in Latin means the middle dog of the Red Valley, because we find it in these red sediments, and middle dog because people thought these things were related to dogs when that genus was first named back 100 years or so ago. And so one thing I've been working on right now is working on finding other specimens or other species related to this. And this is a slide just showing a bunch of fossils, not only from Utah, but also places like Wyoming. San Diego actually has fossils of a similar age. And we're basically doing some work right now to try and figure out, are there other species related to this at other places around the country, places like San Diego, Canada has some, and things like that. So that's the kind of basic kind of baseball card collecting part of paleontology, is just like finding new species, naming them, figuring out who's related to who and things along those sorts of lines. But like I said, one thing I'm more interested in are kind of bigger questions about carnivores in the past, not just naming them, but also figuring out how they interacted with each other, how they interacted with the environment. So when we think of carnivores today, if I said that to you, you would probably think of animals like this: lions, wolves, bears, here in Southern California, maybe mountain lions, things along those sorts of lines, right? So these kind of big animals, right? Well, it turns out, though, that most of the diversity in carnivorous mammals is actually small. It's relatively small. It's things like weasels and badgers and weird things like mongooses and civets and This is the fossa from Madagascar, all sorts of small things. And actually, it turns out that most mammalian carnivores are relatively small. They're only, less than 10 kilograms. 80% of living carnivores are small, less than 10 kilograms. And why is that important? It's important because looking at the past, most of the carnivores from the time period I'm interested in, that Paleogene time period, were also small. Okay. Now, how do we define carnivores? I won't go into the details of this other than to say all modern carnivorans have this specialized pair of cutting teeth or meat cutting teeth. They're called carnassials. You can actually see it a little better in this picture here. This is some wolf teeth, and they basically have an upper tooth and a lower tooth that are modified into blades that can cut past one another and are used to cut meat. Okay, and so all mammalian carnivores today have that. And that's also true of these fossil carnivorans. Okay, so most fossil carnivorans at the time period we're looking at were these kind of things, kind of small, weaselly, raccoony, four-wheel drive looking little guys, probably lived on the ground and maybe spent some time in trees, relatively small bodied, kind of generalist sort of thing. And one of the interesting questions is, how did they diversify into the groups that we see today, like bears and bears and cats and dogs and those sorts of lions? It turns out there's another group of carnivorous mammals that's alive at that time period. They're called the Creodons. They don't have any living relatives, but they also were running around eating meat at this time. And one of the questions that I've tried to answer is, why are these guys still around, and why did this group here go extinct? Now, these Creodons, they also have carnassials, but interestingly, they often have multiple pairs of carnassials. So carnivorans usually only have one pair of upper and lower teeth that they're used for cutting meat. Creodons often have multiple pairs, so they actually modified many of their molars into these slicing teeth. And so, like I said, one of the questions I have is how did they why did one group win and another group lose, right? Why did these guys win? Why are they still around? And why did these guys lose? And so one possibility is that the carnivorans outcompeted the Creodons. That is, that they somehow ecologically beat them out for whatever reason. And there's some criteria that we can use for determining whether they actually did compete with each other. One would be a change in diversity between the two groups. That is, one group basically becoming more diverse and the other group becoming less diverse. And more importantly, that increase and those decrease overlap. Another is that they live in the same place. And then the question that's most interesting to me is whether they were ecologically similar. So there is taxonomic overlap. This line here, this black line here, is for the Creodons, and you can see they get diverse, and then they kind of trail off, and by about 20 million years ago, they're all extinct. Okay, and the carnivorans, the ones that are related to modern carnivores, they kind of bounce along at low diversity, but they keep increasing over time, and they basically and that increase overlaps with the decrease that we see in this other group. And we know that they live in the same places. So we know that these two criteria for competition have been satisfied. So then the question becomes one of, well, did they ecologically compete? Did they actually, compete for resources? Did they compete for environments and things like that? And so my hypothesis that I studied, this was part of my dissertation work, was that these early carnivorans outcompeted the Creodons. And they did that by evolving into more disparate morphologies, basically filling more niches in the ecosystem. And then by doing that, they kind of replaced the Creodons. And I did this using comparisons with modern taxa. And so, I use modern taxa. So these are modern small-bodied taxa. Again, things like badgers and weasels and mongooses, and this is like a meerkat here, and civets and things like that. These guys, I can take a bunch of measurements of their teeth, right? And we know what they do for a living. We know what their diets are. We know what they, how they interact with the environment, what they do for a living, right? And then I can basically use them to build kind of a model for then figuring out what these animals did in the past. So that's exactly what I did. What I did was I took a bunch of measurements of teeth of these guys, and the measurements aren't particularly important, but you can use all these different measurements of their teeth in terms of like how much of their teeth do they devote to grinding versus slicing, how strong were how strong were the muscles, and things along those sorts of lines. And I can basically take a bunch of measurements and then I can come up with some kind of trends. And so the sort of trends that I find were that in general, carnivores, that is animals that mostly eat meat. So this is just to back up a little bit. Carnivore is an ecological term. It means a meat eater. Carnivoran is the taxonomic group that includes lions and tigers and bears and things like that. So in general, in this case, meat eaters have longer blades. Okay, that makes sense, right? And they also have longer moment arms. That is, they tend to have stronger muscles that allow them to make that slicing sort of movement. Omnivores, that is animals that eat things other than meat. They may eat some meat, but they may eat other things, so things like bears and some dogs and raccoons and stuff like that. They tend to devote more of their teeth into grinding as opposed to blades. And then the other kind of group are insectivorous sort of things. So a lot of smaller carnivorans will actually eat insects too, and they tend to have these really skinny, thin jaws because you don't need particularly strong jaws to be able to break up insects. So now what I can do is I can apply these to Eocene carnivorans and I can determine their ecology. And it kind of mostly works. Part of the problem is you saw fossils are very fragmentary. Another problem is that they're not, Creodons and carnivorans aren't directly comparable because Creodons have that funky thing where they have multiple carnassials, but there's ways around that. And basically what you can do, so this is a nice, comparison here. So here is a modern carnivore. This is the fossa from Madagascar, and this is a fossil carnivoran. Here is another Malagasy carnivore, and here is another one with a similar sort of teeth. Here's it's a thing called a Cusimans. It's related to modern. It's a modern mongoose relative, and here's a fossil thing that has similar sort of teeth. So basically, I can figure out what these guys eat by comparing them to the things that I found out about the modern taxa here, right? And when I did that, and I looked at a bunch of different taxa, and you can make all sorts of pretty graphs that show basically how they fill the ecological space, and things like that. And I won't go into the math or the stats here, but basically what you find is kind of what I expected, that both groups started off with overlapping kind of generalized forms where they both kind of filled similar sort of niches. But over time, the carnivorans became more disparate. They evolved omnivorous forms, more carnivorous forms. They evolved insectivorous forms. They basically just kind of filled up the space more. And although the Creodons started more generalized, they basically just got more and more carnivorous over time. That's all they did, was they got bigger and they got more carnivorous. And that's actually something we see again and again in a couple different carnivorous groups. And I'll come back to that in just a second here. So if I go back to my criteria for competition, I can add a new check mark here that they were ecologically similar, right? So the case has been strengthened for this competition between them, and that competition may have led to that eventual extinction of the Creodons. And so one question is, why did they win, right? Why did the carnivorans win? And the answer is probably has to do with that funky, weird thing that the Creodons have all these carnassials. Basically, their dentition only allowed them to become more carnivorous over time. They basically kind of got locked into becoming just eating meat and just eating more meat, right? And actually getting bigger over time as well. Whereas carnivorans kind of started more generalized and could basically diversify into more different sorts of forms, as is shown here. So these guys kind of lock themselves in, and there's a term for this. It was actually coined by, again, my old PhD advisor, Dr. Blair von Valkenburg, where they call this the evolutionary ratchet, where once you kind of get stuck in this, you kind of like ratchet up, it becomes more advantageous, more adaptive to become more and more carnivorous over time, even if in the long term it may cause your eventual extinction, right? And so it's this weird interplay between selection at the individual level to become bigger and more carnivorous, actually causing extinction in the long run. And I'll show another example of that here in a second. The other place, and I've got, I think, just enough time to finish up a couple more slides here. The other place that I've done research is in Kenya. I started doing work there in 2009. There we work at a slightly younger time period from about 20 to 25 million years ago. Where we work is in northern Kenya, up on the west side of Lake Turkana. There's a couple localities we have near there, one called Nokwai and another called Losadok. The environment there looks fairly similar, right? You can see, fairly similar to Utah in the sense that it's, dry now, dry desert sort of thing there. It's much more acacia sort of scrub. You could see, you have badlands similar to what I had in Utah there. Again, you could see pictures of it here. Again, most of it's surface collecting, but every once in a while we do find fossils that we can dig out. And it's, it's pretty primitive living there. This is my home for 6 weeks. We're about a day's drive away from any sort of town or anything like that. And we live there among the local people who are the Turkana. They're mostly goat pastoralists, so they herd their goats through the area. And they, we're basically living in their homes. And one of the reasons why we work there is it's a really interesting time. Prior to this time period, Africa was actually an island. It was separated from Eurasia by an ocean, basically, that went through this area. And at about this time period that we are looking at, it basically smashes into Eurasia and animals can start moving back and forth across there. And prior to this time period, there were a bunch of different animals that lived in Africa, and they're in some ways very different than the animals we think of today, or they're related to the things we see today, but they were filling, it was only these sorts of animals. So things like hyraxes, elephants, aardvarks, elephant shrews. This is an extinct group of rhino-like things. There were creodonts there, but no carnivorans. And that'll come into play in a second. There were primates there, a few rodent groups, one hoofed animal group here, and many of these have modern relatives. So hyraxes today, they look like this. I always say they look like a cross between a guinea pig and a watermelon. But back in the Oligocene, they were actually much more diverse. They got to moose size sorts of things. There were primates at that time. There were elephants of various sorts, or elephant relatives of various sorts. These are cynotheres, these rhino-like things. There's little elephant shrews. Many of these animals are actually related to each other in this broader group called afrotheres. The closest living relative of modern elephants are actually these guys here, and actually these guys here, which is really interesting. But one thing to notice is that which mammals were not part of island Africa, which animals were not in Africa prior to this. And that includes the things that we associate with Africa today: antelope, rhinos, giraffes, zebras, warthogs, all the carnivores like lions and leopards and jackals and stuff like that. They arrived from Eurasia at about this time period. And so basically all these things here are all immigrants, right? All the things that we mostly associate. Now, obviously some of these we still have representatives of them, but they've mostly been replaced, or at least have become much less diverse and much less numerous, right? And so one thing that I study as part of our research there is, again, the carnivores. And the carnivores that we have from there, what's really interesting is it turns out that some of the earliest of the immigrants that we get into Africa from Eurasia are carnivorans, right? And so they're probably relatives of modern day civets and mongooses and things like that. The fossils aren't much to look at. They're these, busted jaws with a few teeth in them, but they're enough for us to tell that these are related to modern day civets and mongooses and things along those lines. And they are the first to kind of get into Africa from Eurasia, which is an interesting thing. Another animal that we have from there is a new species we got to name. One of the earliest saber-tooth morphologies is from there. So that's this guy here. And so there's some saber-tooth things. This is a saber-tooth group not related to the saber-tooths we have like in the La Brea tar pits here, which are much younger. They're a different group of saber-tooths. They're one of the first groups to become saber-tooths. But again, carnivorans, these guys are the first ones to get in there. And like I said, they're also creodons in Africa. They were filling the carnivore niche for a very long time, right? And only once these carnivorans get into Africa, they all get replaced. It's almost a similar story to what we saw in North America. So you see the same sort of thing. Here's that graph from North America again, you know, carnivorans kind of getting more numerous and creodons basically going extinct. You see the same sort of graph in Africa, that as soon as the carnivorans get into Africa, they go off and, you know, become much more diverse, and the creodons become less and less, and they eventually go extinct, right? And we can actually do the same sort of analyses that I did in North America, in Africa, and I did do this sort of work, and I won't go into the details of it, but basically, you can do some stats and look at similar sort of things, but basically you see the same sort of ecological replacement as well. So it's the same story again. The creodons tend to ratchet up in size, you know, as they become more and more carnivorous and actually larger and larger in size. But there's lots of small things around, you know, to eat, primates and rodents and elephant shrews. And so the first Neogene taxa to enter, the first of this kind of modern African taxa to enter, are these small carnivorans who may have exploited that niche. And so this combination of this ratchet and replacement may have had a role in the extinction of creodonts in Africa. Eventually, they go extinct all over the world. There's an interesting study looking at because they were also in Eurasia and they go extinct there. And so there's all sorts of, basically, as soon as the carnivorans kind of get in anywhere, they seem to go extinct. They seem to have been more susceptible to going extinct. And again, it was similar to what we saw in North America. And actually, I just had a study come out recently looking at a similar sort of thing in South America. South America is different in that South America did not have creodons, but it had marsupials and marsupial carnivores. And marsupials also got really big. Marsupial carnivores also got really big, and they also went extinct, right? And there, it's less clear that it may have been due to carnivorans because the carnivorans kind of got in later. So both in Africa and in South America, you see these things get big and more carnivorous, and then, but the creodons do it even more so than the South American things, and they go extinct around the same time that carnivorans get in Africa. And the South Americans, though, they're pretty much more, the marsupials are pretty much more extinct by the time the true carnivorans get there. And so something else may have happened. They may have just ratcheted themselves to extinction, or climate change may have had some part in it, or something like that. And we're working on trying to tease that sort of stuff out. So I think with that, I'll stop and answer any questions that people have. And I know I talk really fast, so you probably have lots of questions. And I think, Lauren, you were going to maybe pass the questions on.
Yes. So if you have any questions, feel free to put that in the Q&A feature down below. Doesn't look like we have any quite yet. But I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for going over all of that. That was very fascinating. And man, it makes wish I took one of your classes when I was a student at UCLA. Didn't quite get down to South Campus too much, but
You're lost.
I know, totally. So could you just share a little bit about like what sparked your interest to go into this field and do this research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did not plan on doing this. So when I was graduating undergraduate at Washington University, I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I had this guy Tab, who I mentioned, he had just started that project in Utah, and I had taken a bunch of classes from him and, made a connection with him. And he just came up to me at the, as I was getting ready to graduate and said, "Hey, do you want to come live in a tent for 6 weeks in Utah and collect fossils and play in the dirt?" I was like, hell yeah, I do. And so the rest, as they say, is history. I caught the bug then and just really got into just not only the science of it, but just the kind of the lifestyle. It's just, doing field work's really fun. I like camping. It's not always pleasant, like most of the places where I do field work, it's over 100 degrees most days and things like that. But I just love it. It's great fun.
That's great. Okay, it looks like we do have a few questions that came in. One is, how does your research tell us about how our future might look in terms of which animals might be more resistant to extinction?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, one thing is that, bigger animals tend to go extinct much more readily, right? And so we saw that again and again and again. And so certainly, and we're already seeing that in what's going on now. Bigger animals, because bigger animals tend to be at smaller population sizes, just because they're bigger, they tend to be much more prone to go extinct. And that's what we see in the fossil record, and that's what we're starting to see now. It's probably also what we saw, in terms of the megafaunal extinctions relatively recently. When humans got to an area, the big animals tend to go extinct. And that partly was due to humans hunting them and stuff like that. But it's also partly just due to, climatic changes and stuff like that happen. So that's one thing. Another is that animals that are more specialized, if you're more specialized, you have less ability to kind of adapt. And so that's another thing that we see is, so again, so the kind of really special animals, specialized animals and special animals, they're going to be the ones that are going to go more extinct. So big things, specialized things, and that's what we see in the fossil record and what we would expect to see going on now.
Next question is, how does the current global warming compare to the subtropical temperatures that existed before the time you studied?
Yeah, good question. There that you were starting from a much warmer place already, right? So it was a much warmer time already. And so in terms of kind of like absolute temperatures, we're not going to see that same sort of thing. We're not going to see tropical, the tropics coming up into, southern, the southwestern US or up into Canada or anything like that. But in terms of the magnitude of change, that's the similar thing. So we're talking about 4 to 5 degrees of change, and that's what we expect to see today and what we saw back then.
Great. And then what do these trends tell us about what might be happening in the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, the things that we can see, from this is that, well, one is, the stuff I talked about before, that, that big animals, that more specialized animals tend to go extinct when there's any sort of change that happens, right? So that's one thing. And then the other is that in some ways, we can try and make predictions about these sorts of things, but we don't always know, right? Some of it's just unpredictable. So anytime you kind of mess with a system like this and you make these big sorts of changes, and that's another kind of difference between what was going on in the past and now, the time period we were talking about in the past, those temperature changes happened over the order of, thousands of years. We're doing that same sort of temperature change in hundreds of years or less than that, right? And so if you have that big of a jolt to the system, you're going to have really unpredictable sorts of results. So we can make some guesses, but again, since the time scale is so different, you're probably going to lose even more, because the animals that might have been able to adapt at those 1,000, 10,000 year sorts of time scales, they're not going to be able to adapt in 100 years, right? And so that's the big difference here.
Wonderful. I believe those are all of the questions that came in. And then for our alumni who aren't familiar or who maybe didn't have an opportunity to participate in it, can you share a little bit more about the cluster program at UCLA?
Oh, I would love to. I love to talk about the cluster program. So the cluster program at UCLA is a really unique program. It's just for first-year students. And these are year-long courses that are kind of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary is probably the better term to use here, where we bring teams of faculty to talk about one topic. So we have cluster courses on biotechnology and society. I teach in one called Evolution of the Cosmos and Life. There's ones on race and indigeneity in the US. There's one on global Islam. And all of them are taught by teams of 4 or 5 faculty that all kind of address this bigger topic. So for instance, in the biotech cluster, they might do a unit on genetically modified organisms, and they'll have a biologist that's part of the team that might talk about, the mechanics of should we, how do we put fish genes in a tomato, right? And then they'll have somebody from sociology that should be talking about, should we be putting fish genes in a tomato, right? And then they might have somebody from English who'll have people read a story that has genetically modified organisms, and students will critique the portrayal of it. So it's these really unique courses. And again, they're year long. So they help with that transition to college because again, they're only for first year students. They're also all general education courses. So it's a really, it's an award-winning program. It's a model that a lot of other schools are trying to use. And to get that sort of experience as a first year student, to get to know faculty and things like that, especially at a big research institution like UCLA, it's a pretty unique experience and something we're really proud of. We enroll about a third of the incoming class takes a cluster course, and we're hoping to expand it so that every freshman gets an opportunity to do that. So right now we enroll about 2,000 students, a little over 2,000 students across 10 or 11 of these cluster courses every year. And they're great. Like I said, I teach in one called Evolution of the Cosmos and Life that has an astronomer, a geologist, and a couple biologists, one of them being me. And we cover everything from the Big Bang to the origin of humans and everything in between. And so they're a great program. I should say, even for alumni, we've had, we actually have a UCLA alumnus who has come back. He's a retired doctor. He's in his 70s, and he has sat in on every one of the cluster courses. He just comes in, he sits there, he takes notes. And so if you ever want to come in and sit on a class, just drop me a line. I'd be, we love to have people come and experience that.
How cool. Good to know. Looks like somebody took the Cosmos cluster in 2009,
Woot!
2010.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, I say we'll probably have time for one more question.
Sure.
Somebody who potentially did unicamp with you. As we see human interference to ecosystems like pipelines, can we expect extinction at faster rates?
Yeah, again, and I did do unicamp many years ago. I used to work with unicamp.
What was your camp name?
The General.
General. It's good.
Yeah, because I used to run the backpacking trips that they did for the older kids. So we used to do these 25-mile backpacking trips up to the top of Mount San Gorgonio, and I helped run that program. So again, anytime you do these big shocks to the system, so things like, localized sorts of things like pipelines and those sorts of things, the animals there, they don't have time to adapt. And so at least with those localized things, you might hope that they can move away to a different area. But as that stuff becomes much more widespread, there's nowhere for them to go. And they either need to adapt or die. And in the short time periods that happen, they just don't have time to do that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon and sharing your research with us. That was really, really fascinating.
Awesome. It's my pleasure.
Great. So thank you, Bruins, for joining us this afternoon. I do want to share 2 links with you. One is UCLA One. This is our networking platform. So we encourage you to continue the conversation there with our online Bruin networking community. And then I also linked to our Bruin Promise website. This is a website that provides you unlimited access to the university's vast resources and offerings. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Thanks so much, and go Bruins. Thanks, Dr. Friscia.